Hey everybody, Bella here. So a few months ago I watched The Defenders on Netflix. I love Matt Murdock and I mostly watched the show for him. He's awesome. But while I was watching the show, I realized there was one character that I really connected with and that I actually wanted to learn more about. And that was Danny Rand. Now I had heard a whole lot of bad reviews and just bad feedback on the Iron Fist, but after watching The Defenders and then watching the Iron Fist because I wanted to find out more about Danny, I realized that the critics and the fans were a bit too harsh on their judgments. So here are 8 things that critics and fans got wrong about the Iron Fist and Danny Rand, and my refutes for them. So I'll start with, who is Danny Rand? Danny is a New York boy, white, very white. He comes from a rich family. When he's 10 years old, he crash lands in his When he's 10 years old, his plane crashes in the Himalayas. He loses both his parents in the crash, but he miraculously survives and is taken in by a group of monks from a kingdom called Kunlun, which is like the 7th kingdom of heaven. He is trained in martial arts, and they claim him to be their new Iron Fist, who is the protector of Kunlun. Kunlun is only open to our world once every 15 years, which means it takes Daddy 15 years to come back home and try to reclaim what he has lost. Now, complaint number 1 in regards to Iron Fist and Danny Rand. Complaint number 1 is Danny is just another white, rich, privileged boy, and we have too many of those. So Danny is white, which means he does have some white privilege, and he does come from a rich family, as I said earlier. But the thing is, that doesn't disqualify the other factors in Danny's character. Danny is also a severely traumatized, grief-stricken character. He has grown up in isolation and in an arguably abusive, traumatic situation, and he has been made to believe certain things about the world and certain things about himself that aren't necessarily true. When he comes home, he is faced with rejection, unfriendliness, and almost disgust from people he once knew as friends and family. And this is really, really hard on him. To say Danny is white, rich, and privileged, and therefore that just disqualifies him as a character, is actually really harsh and really unfair. Just because you have more privilege than other people, that doesn't disqualify other factors in your character. That's like saying, since Black Panther is the Prince of Wakanda and has all this power, his characterization doesn't matter. It's stripping down the character to only one facet of who they are. And I'm going to get into why Danny is so much more than just a white, privileged, rich kid. But I'm going to get into that as I go through the different complaints. So complaint number 2 is that Danny wasn't Asian. So there was this huge kerfuffle about, oh, Danny Rand should have been Asian. And I thought it was because he was Asian in the comics. I had never read the comics, so I didn't know. But I did my research, and no, he was white in the comics. So there was absolutely no reason to be so up in arms about him not being Asian. Unless they did a different Iron Fist story with one of the many, many other Iron Fists that have protected Kunlun, there was no reason to make Danny Asian. It is like making Luke Cage a Mexican or a Latino, because Mexicans and Latinos have just as much trouble on the streets. People would have been really, really upset, and they would have been like, no, Luke is African American, he's not Mexican or Latino or whatever else they could have made him. So it's unfair to just jump to the conclusion that since Danny is an Asian, his character is now no longer valid. Completely unfair statement, and it would have been going against the source material, the legitimate canon, and kind of a giant tall finger to all of the fans of this character who have known him in a specific way. It wouldn't have been classy, and it wouldn't have been appropriate. Not to mention, it's kind of offensive, as well as a frustrating double standard for media and fans to claim we should have changed Danny's ethnicity. I kind of find that really offensive. I understand that everyone wants representation in the media. We should have Japanese heroes, Korean heroes, African American heroes, Mexican heroes. We should have Indian heroes. Okay, we should have all of these things, but we shouldn't do that by overriding a character that's already been written to be a certain ethnicity. It's just wrong. It's not right. And honestly, there are many, many other ways to bring diversity into our media than by changing characters who are already fixed in canon as a certain color or race. Complaint number 3 is that Danny is a man-child and very violent. So yes, in the first few episodes especially, Danny displays these violent outbursts and this very short temper. Now, in my humble opinion, Danny suffers from PTSD on a number of levels, as well as grief and emotions that have not been faced yet. So, Danny has all of the symptoms of a soldier who has gone through PTSD. And I have known people with PTSD, so I know this to be a fact. People with PTSD can react violently, they can be aggressive, they don't like being opposed for long lengths of time. So Danny does get violent, aggressive, and short-tempered with everyone around him. He doesn't have a lot of control over his emotions. This is actually an immaturity. He isn't super mature when it comes to dealing with his emotions in a adult and respectable way. I'm going to get into this immaturity inside of Danny as I go through the complaints, but to put in perspective his violence, that is a symptom of PTSD, trauma in general, and a unfaced or unrecognized grief. Danny was taught to suffocate or bury all of his emotions, and he hasn't yet had time to deal with the stuff that has happened to him in his past, so he does get violent and aggressive. You see him breaking into houses, you see him approaching women in a way that might be considered, aggressive or violent, and you see him even with friends reacting badly when they oppose him and doing dangerous, reckless things that could put both their lives in jeopardy. All of these things are things that Danny actually grows in. He doesn't stay violent and aggressive. He actually matures a lot during this show, and he learns that the anger and the violence are not appropriate ways to deal with the situation, so he starts improving and trying to find other ways, other outlets to express himself. Complaint number 4 is that the Iron Fist story had a really slow build-up. So yeah, I will give you, Iron Fist had a really slow build-up. The first few episodes especially were just kind of this easing into the whole feel of the story. However, if you go into Iron Fist knowing, like the first 6 episodes or so are pretty slow and are mostly just character-driven and getting into the mythology and into these people's heads, I think you will really enjoy it. A lot of people said the same thing about Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. when it first came out, that season 1 was boring. Give Iron Fist its sweet time. Enjoy it like a fine coffee or tea. Let it take its time. It picks up a lot near the end, and personally, I would rather have a show that starts out slow and has a strong, exciting end than a show that starts out exciting and then fizzles out at the end of the season. All I'm saying is give it a chance. Just because it is slow, it doesn't automatically make the story bad. Complaint number 5 is that the characters were not well-rounded, and there was really nothing going for any of these characters. With Joy Meacham, I totally agree with you. I think Joy is kind of a character that goes nowhere, and this poor actress just needed a lot more to work with. However, I do not believe that's true for all of the characters. We have Claire from Daredevil, who is, as always, awesome. She's a great character. We have Colleen Wing, who even people who hate the Iron Fist love Colleen. She's just great. Everything about her is great. She's adorable. She's strong. She's wonderful. You've got Ward Meacham. Okay, just quickly straying from the topic, Ward Meacham is a great character. He starts out as kind of like a villain and an antagonist, and I just love his whole arc and his whole story. He's a great side character, and he's a great buffer between the main villain, who is, I will not disclose his name, but he's a great buffer between the main villain and Danny. He's kind of like this in-between character that builds a lot of tension, and I just really love that about him. And then you have Danny Rand, who actually is a very interesting and complex character, and I'm going to get more into that. And the way Finn Jones portrays this character is very good. I think he did an amazing job with Danny. So to say that the characters are not fleshed out, they did not do a good job on them, I think is hypercritical and completely wrong. I think the side characters really hold up the show. I think the show is very character driven, and if we had different actors or the characters had been written differently, I really think the show would have fallen flat on its face. But because the characters were so good and the actors were so good, it really brought the show up off its feet and drove the whole plot. Complaint number 6, it was too much like Arrow. It was an Arrow ripoff. So I have seen both Arrow and Iron Fist, and I really don't see that much that is similar between them. Danny and Oliver are completely different. The stories are completely different. There are some similarities in the backstory, and I will give you that. But this is true for all superheroes. Batman and Iron Man also have some similarities in their backstory, but they are actually very, very different. I haven't read the comics, so maybe this is different for the comics. But I still believe, even if there are lots of similarities, that doesn't disqualify the Iron Fist story. I think there is enough different between them that Iron Fist is still just as good. And personally, I like Danny better than Oliver. The way Danny deals with things, the way Danny interacts with his friends and his allies is completely different than the way Oliver deals with things and the way Oliver interacts with his family and allies. So I think the Iron Fist is well worth a watch, even if you have seen Arrow. You may see some similarities between them, and you may say, oh, that's a lot like how Oliver got to this point, but that doesn't disqualify his story, and that shouldn't just any more than it would disqualify Doctor Strange's story just because he and Iron Man share some similarities. Both of them being white, both of them being super intelligent, both of them being super rich, both of them having to be directly affected by things they had done to see the light and to come out of it a better man. You know, those are things that they have in common, but that doesn't disqualify each of their characters because they both have a very different journey. So I think that goes for Danny as well, and it's not a super valid complaint. Complaint number 7 with the Iron Fist and with Danny Rand is that, and this is the one I'm really going to focus on, is that Danny was not mature and he was not respectful. I kind of had this back a few complaints ago with the man-child thing. But a lot of people got really hung up on the fact that Danny had no maturity and he acted like a little boy. I'm going to kind of go off on this a little bit. So the way Danny was raised, it was very brutal and very isolated. Danny's mental health and mental well-being is rather stunted. He's stuck in this sort of naive, innocent age. He spent all of his growing up years, all of his teen years in this isolated kingdom, training for martial arts, hearing all of these weird ideas, learning to suffocate emotions, and never coping with the grief he had as a child. And all of these factors really pushed down his mental capacity to grow. And it has given him this sort of stunted maturity in his thinking and his way of coping with things. This happens to children who are traumatized. I have seen it happen. They are stunted in their mental growth. They can't understand or grasp things in the same way a healthy adult can. However, they can learn to grow. And with Danny, this is very apparent. He doesn't stay super immature. He grows a lot in Iron Fist. And I think with this show, it has amazing potential. And Danny has amazing potential. And he is just going to keep growing. Because in The Defenders, he had some great character development that brought him even farther than he had gone in Iron Fist. I think he's just going to keep growing and keep maturing and learning to handle himself in a mature, adult, and respectful way. In my humble opinion, I think Matt would be a great mentor for Danny. Matt knows himself really, really well. Matt is strong in his beliefs. Matt is mature. He's actually very wise. And I think that's what Danny really needs. It's just a good, wise, thoughtful, strong mentor to lead him on his journey. But the point is that Danny, yes, he can be very immature and childlike. This is a direct after effect of the trauma and the griefs he has been through and the strange, unique way that he was raised. It is not his fault. He has these problems. I completely have faith in this character for growing through them. I think he's going to get much better and much older, but you'll have to accept that this is going to be something Danny has to deal with his whole life. Just like his temper, just like the violence and the aggression he has inside of him. These are all things that are a direct result of what has happened to him, and they are things he's going to be struggling with his whole life. And we'll have to acknowledge that and understand where this character is coming from to really enjoy this character. You can't expect him to behave as a normal person when he wasn't raised as a normal person, when he hasn't been just even in the normal world for more than a year. So it's not fair to assume he should deal with things and understand things the same way we do when he hasn't had any chance to deal or understand things the way we do. Danny has an amazing capacity to humble himself before others. He is incredibly willing to learn. When people come to him with advice, or with ideas on how to approach this situation or that situation differently, it may take Danny a while, but he actually listens, understands, and responds really well to guidance. And he is very willing to learn. He will take a step back and say, is the way I'm doing it the right thing? Am I misjudging something? Should I do it this way? Are they right? He will question himself, and he will take the advice of others and the guidance of others gracefully and humbly. I think it's an amazing capacity that he has, and that he will continue to grow in it, as well as grow in himself and learn who he is and where his beliefs and his strengths lie. So the 8th complaint for Iron Fist is that he is a very weak character and he didn't contribute anything to the Defenders. There were a bunch of memes saying things like, you know, Daredevil is blind and handicapped, Luke Cage is the tough guy looking out for his own, Jessica Jones is the traumatized kid, and then you've got Danny Rand. I already kind of covered this in my earlier problems, so I'm not going to say a whole lot about it, but I'm going to leave it here. Danny was the only character in the Defenders besides Daredevil that I actually cared about and wanted to learn more about. I didn't really care about Luke, and I didn't really care about Jessica. Danny was intriguing, and he was new. I think people are really hard on Danny because he is such a different type of superhero. He actually grew up a lot in the Defenders. He was very respectful of all of them, and he was the one most willing to do what had to be done to take down the Hand. He's like, straight up, this is my destiny, you know? And I'm also going to say, okay, if Daredevil doesn't matter to you, this won't matter to you either. But I am going to say, of all of the Defenders, Matt chose Danny to relay his last words to. He told Danny to protect his city. He didn't say it out loud, he didn't say it to everybody. He chose Danny because I think Matt found a kindred spirit in Danny. Matt trusted Danny, and that also means Matt respected Danny enough to know he was going to fulfill this giant task. It was kind of like an oath or a burden that Matt was passing on to someone else because he didn't think he was going to make it. And he doesn't tell Luke, he doesn't tell Jessica, he didn't even choose Claire, who he has more of a connection with anyway. No, he tells Danny, and I think that's a really important and pivotal thing to remember. Danny was the one Daredevil put his trust into. Danny is the one Daredevil respected, and that says something for his character. So a lot of these complaints, I think, have not a whole lot of bearing. I think people just really wanted to hate on Danny and the whole Iron Fist story. They get hung up on how violent and erratic Danny was, and they don't stop to think about what the story is and who Danny is. I know the violence was a huge big deal, and I'm going to set aside these last 3 minutes to kind of discuss Danny in general. So, Danny is a very haunted character. Okay, he lost his parents at a very young age and was then trained to believe grief, anger, regret, sorrow, guilt, all of the emotions that make us human were not acceptable and had to be buried or stowed away somewhere. He was trained to believe that weapons don't feel, and that since he's going to become a weapon, the immortal Iron Fist, he can't feel, and he had no outlet for this grief and this trauma. In the show, you see plenty of times where Danny has flashbacks, Danny has nightmares, Danny has hallucinations, and he sees or hears things that aren't there. He's obviously very haunted. All of these things come with PTSD and trauma, which is why I truly believe that Danny has it. Putting those things aside, the anger and the guilt that he is struggling with, I think he has severe survivor's guilt, rather like Iron Man. He can't grasp how he survived and his parents didn't. And he's always wanted to believe maybe his mom lived because he didn't actually ever find her body, which also haunts him hugely. Danny is very naive and very trusting, and as Cleo says, he has this sort of beautiful innocence. He sees everything in clear blacks and whites, goods and evils. He has trouble accepting that there are areas of gray where you can do bad things for a good reason or good things for maybe a bad reason. But as the show progresses, he learns and grows in this particular area. He begins to understand the world isn't cut and dry this way. But the innocence and the naive way of thinking that Danny has are actually huge contributors to his character. He's got this gentleness and this deep compassion and kindness. He wants to see the best in everybody. But this means he's also very sensitive. And when people hurt him or when people betray his trust, he is affected really badly. He'll react badly. He often reacts like a teenage boy who just doesn't know how to deal with these complex emotions. These are all things that Danny definitely has room to grow in. He will grow in them, but I think it's important to understand where Danny is coming from and how hard this is for Danny. He is basically from another world, in another culture, in another society. He gets culture shocked coming back to New York. He sees his company that his dad started to do good in the world being corrupted and being used for evil. He sees people he thought he could trust doing bad things and hurting good people. His friends betray him. His allies lie to him. You know, he has lots of reasons to be distrustful and to be angry. And I don't think it's very fair to just assume Danny is a man-child and super sensitive when the things he's dealing with, even a mature and healthy adult would struggle with. And Danny is neither healthy nor mature. As Cleo says, he could really benefit from some psychiatric care. He and Colleen could really use some help, but you shouldn't expect him to act like any other normal adult who hasn't had these problems. He has suffered great losses and great griefs, and this has affected his character radically. But Danny has great capacity to grow. Danny has great capacity to improve. Danny wants to learn. Danny wants to improve. Danny is a good guy who really just needs some guidance and some time to get experience in the real world and how things really work. If you haven't watched Iron Fist yet, if you have heard these bad reviews, if you've seen bad comments, bad feedback, I encourage you to just watch Iron Fist, put all of your opinions aside for the moment, and just watch it. Accept that Danny is going to be a character that is haunted and troubled. He does lack maturity and he can be violent and aggressive. This doesn't define him as a violent, aggressive person, but as someone who is dealing with a trauma or a fault. And this is something he will have to learn and grow through. Accept that Danny can be very naive and childish, and that this is actually a great benefactor to his character because it brings into him this innocence and this compassion that is so rarely found in adults. And accept that Iron Fist is going to be a slow burn. Not a whole lot's going to happen. Just take your time to enjoy it as you would take your time to enjoy, a fine tea. It's not going to be like Daredevil where it's just go, 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 go. It is going to be a bit slower, a bit more thoughtful, more character driven. But put your opinions aside and just watch it and try to put yourself in Danny's shoes. Think of Danny as a whole and not just as fractions of his parts. Don't minimize him to white privilege. Don't minimize him to the violent man who just always loses his temper. Take his character as a whole and just see if you can appreciate it. You might surprise yourself.